So, this lecture is on the classical school, choice, and deterrence theories. The classical school clearly follows the pre-classical school, also known as a demonic perspective. Now, if you recall, the demonic perspective was based on religion and based on the idea that kings and queens had the divine right to rule from God, and that individuals committed crimes, they were possessed by some demon or were influenced by Satan. Classical school emerged out of the Enlightenment movement. If you recall from high school, there were many Enlightenment thinkers: Voltaire, Montesquieu, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. These thinkers took a naturalistic and rationalistic approach. These thinkers created a new concept of man. They shaped art, they shaped the criminal justice systems, they shaped governments. Under the Enlightenment movement, these thinkers explained that the power to govern does not come from God. It's not a divine right. Rather, the power to govern comes from the people. Hobbes's famous book, The Leviathan, is one example of how we became to understand humankind. In The Leviathan, Hobbes argued that in man's natural state, it is a state of war. Our survival mechanisms come into play. We seek our own self-interests at the expense of others. We would kill other humans for food, not to eat them, but to steal their food. We would kill anyone who gets in the way of our own pursuits, our own self-interests. But we are also very fearful of our own violent death. As a result, Hobbes argued that we must form a social contract. We must come together and agree to give up certain liberties to protect our own safety. So we will agree not to kill others to protect ourselves and our own self-interests. Under this social contract, laws are established. The enforcer of those laws is established. Our self-interest pursuits are limited. And when individuals violate those laws or violate the limits of their self-interest, this social contract outlines that punishment. Now, this is an incredibly different way of thinking than getting the divine right to rule from God. Rather, the people come together and select someone to rule. They give the right to govern to this ruler. So the Enlightenment movement questioned the current political power of the time. It was very much accepted by intellectuals, and it caused two major revolutions. I'm wondering if you can think about what those might be. Well, you have the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Both of these revolutions led to the idea of the separation between church and state, the separation of God from the government. The Enlightenment movement heavily influenced criminology. In particular, two classical theorists, Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham, emerged from these Enlightenment thinkers. Beccaria wrote the book An Essay on Crimes and Punishments. It was published in 1764. Here, he presents the first modern scientific theory of crime. Mind you, this book was condemned by the Catholic Church. In his book, he criticized spiritualism, the demonic perspective, and its legal system. He argued that the legal system under the kings and the queens was capricious and arbitrary. He argued that punishments and assessments of the accused were determined on a whim, based on the feelings of the kings and the queens of the day. He argued that the punishments were arbitrary. You could commit a crime on Tuesday, you can be accused of that crime, and your punishment could be St. Catherine's wheel. On Wednesday, your friend commits the same crime, is accused of that crime, and your friend's punishment is carrying a hot iron for a mile. Because the punishments were administered arbitrarily and capriciously, this meant that individuals cannot make rational decisions. So this is the key aspect of the Enlightenment thinking and the classical thinking. So Beccaria, just like Enlightenment thinkers, they argued that individuals, humans, have free will. We are rational. We make decisions based on pleasure over pain. Because of that, because we have free will, because we are rational, then we are responsible for our own behavior. We made a choice. Therefore, we must suffer the consequences of that choice. We base those choices on pleasure over pain. Because we all have free will, because we are all rational, we all must be treated equally before the law. It's not arbitrary. It's not capricious. It's not whatever the ruling power feels that day. We are all treated equally. Because we make rational decisions of pleasure over pain, all the laws must be published. We must be able to know the consequences of our actions. We must know in advance of the punishment that would be imposed if we chose to commit crime over not committing the crime. We must be able to weigh if the punishment outweighs the benefit of engaging in the criminal behavior. Because he criticized so much the legal system under the pre-classical era, or the demonic perspective, or the spiritualist perspective, he argued that we must have a speedy trial, that we must have a jury trial. It can't be a decision of one or two people. And we must be considered innocent until proven guilty. As you can see, this is the foundation of the United States Bill of Rights. Beccaria argued that the sole purpose of punishment is to deter crime. On page 29 in your textbook, Beccaria outlines general and specific deterrence. He wrote this in 1764. He says, "The end of punishment is no other than to prevent the criminal from doing further injury to society," specific deterrence, "and to prevent others from committing the like offense," general deterrence. The sole purpose of punishment is to deter. He explains that the punishment must have celerity, certainty, and severity, meaning the punishment must be swift, certain, and severe enough. It must be proportionate to the crime. If it's too severe, it won't deter. If it's not severe enough, it won't deter. So it must fit the crime. He argued that punishment shall not include torture or death. He was against capital punishment. He argued that punishment shall not be cruel or unusual. Another one of our Bill of Rights. Beccaria actually argued that certainty has a greater effect on deterrence than does severity or celerity. On page 29, he actually argues this is certainty of a small punishment will make a stronger impression than the fear of one or more severe punishments. So that's Beccaria. Bentham is another classical theorist. He wrote an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, which was published in 1789. And he echoes Beccaria's sentiments. He explains that the sole purpose of punishment is to deter. Again, the punishment must fit the crime. Punishment that is too severe is unjust, and punishment that is not severe enough will not deter. They've actually done studies on this. Now, here's an example of one study. Parking meters. So they set up parking meters, and they put on the parking meter the fine for not paying the meter, for parking your car and not paying the meter. One parking meter A, it was a 30-minute parking for 25 cents, and the fine was $50. Parking meter B, 25 cents to park your car for 30 minutes, and the fine was $200. Parking meter C, 25 cents to park your car, and the fine for not paying the meter was $5,000. Now, which one do you think most people paid? Well, it's actually parking meter B. And here's why. An individual who pulled up to parking meter A saw 25 cents, 30 minutes, the fine is only $50. I'll take that risk. Maybe I won't get caught for 30 minutes. Maybe I'll only be there for 20 minutes. Maybe I won't get caught. And I'll take the risk. $50, fine. It's not going to burn a hole in my pocket. Parking meter C, that is an excessive fine. That individual is going to fight that ticket because it is too severe. While parking meter B, people are like, oh, I don't want to have to pay that. So they feed that meter. Okay, so Bentham, just like Beccaria says, the sole purpose of punishment is to deter. Bentham says that we are all hedonistic. Does anyone know what that means? So hedonistic means that we are pleasure seekers. We seek the most pleasure with the least amount of pain. Clearly, this is why we brush our teeth every morning, because we want to talk to people, we don't want our breath to stink, we want to have the pleasure of talking to others, and so we brush our teeth, right? We're choosing the pleasure of talking to others, the pain of smelling. Now, Bentham says that because we're hedonistic, we are these pleasure seekers, and because we're rational, right, we weigh the pleasure over the pain. In our little heads, we have what he calls a Felicefic calculus, the happiness calculator. He actually says that in our heads, we can calculate the amount of pleasure we're going to receive from any particular act. And so he outlines these 7 criteria under which we make these kinds of decisions. So we ask ourselves, the first one, duration. How long will this pleasure last? If this pleasure is going to last me 2 minutes, 5 minutes, forever, you're more likely to do it. How intense is this pleasure? Is it something that I'm going to hold on to forever? I'm going to feel it. It's going to be really impactful. Then I'm more likely to do it. What's the propinquity of this pleasure? Meaning, how near is it in time and space? Something I'm going to wait for a very, very, very long time. What's the extent of this pleasure? Right? How widely does it cover? Does it cover others? So if I steal this gaming system, like not only will I have fun playing it, but my friends will have fun playing it. Maybe my kids will have fun playing it. That's wide extent. How certain is the pleasure? Is it guaranteed? Is it really likely that I would experience some sort of pleasure from this? How pure is this pleasure? Will I do this and then experience some sort of pain? And then how much fecundity does this pleasure have? Meaning, will it lead to further pleasure? Almost like you have that thing in your head that no matter what else you're thinking about, you think about this one memory and it just makes you laugh. Every time you think about it, it makes you laugh. That's fecundity. So we have this calculator. And when we add up all of these 7 different criteria for this one particular act, and that sum is a lot of pleasure over the pain, then we're more likely to do it. But if the punishment outweighs that pleasure just enough, we will choose not to engage in that behavior. So the purpose of punishment is to deter. So Bentham argues that there are some cases in which punishment will not deter. He calls these cases unmeet for punishment. He says when punishment is needless, unprofitable, inefficacious, and groundless, it shall not be imposed. So here he says, where the penal provision could produce no effect on him, with respect to the preventing him from engaging in any act of the sort in question, that provision ought not to be inflicted. In other words, when the punishment will not deter the individual from engaging in that behavior, then we should not impose that punishment. He says, punishment ought only to be admitted in as far as it promises to exclude some greater evil. So if it doesn't prevent or deter some greater evil, then it's unprofitable. It's an ineffective form of punishment. So when we think about crimes today, you should probably consider which crimes have very high recidivism rates. That regardless of how often we punish an individual, no matter how light of a punishment or severe of a punishment we impose, individuals continue to engage in this crime. It's like the revolving door. These crimes primarily fall under our victimless crimes: prostitution, drug use, gambling. No matter how many times we arrest someone and convict them of prostitution, the very next moment we release them, they're back on that street prostituting. The punishment is unprofitable. The same thing with drug use. We can never fight an addiction with punishment. So that's the classical theory. Those theorists fall under the classical school, the foundation of the US and France and many other countries' legal systems. 3 lasting ideas are based on classical criminology. First, laws should be applied to everyone equally. The criminal justice system is blind justice. 2, we are rational individuals. Therefore, when we make a choice, we must suffer the consequences. Third, the punishment should fit the crime. I want to be clear here. Both Bentham and Beccaria argued that the punishment fitting the crime is measured by how much harm is done to society, not how much harm is done to a victim. When you're looking at harm done to a victim, you're looking at individual justice. You're trying to get justice for the victim. That's retribution. When you're looking at punishment to prevent some greater evil, you are basing the punishment on deterring the crime from happening. You're basing the punishment on how much injury is done to the society. That's why in our criminal justice system, you have the accused against the state. It's not against the victim. It's against the prosecuting attorney who represents the state. So classical deterrence had, as you can imagine, significant impacts on our contemporary crime control policies. Long-lasting impacts. The United States criminal justice system abandoned rehabilitation as a crime control strategy. Right? The idea is that we can punish our way out of crime. The system began to focus, and as our policies as well began to focus on increasing the certainty and severity of punishment. As a result, our incarceration rate increased 5-fold from the 1970s through the early 2000s. And here, the United States is quite exceptional. The United States has a higher propensity to incarcerate, which means that compared to other countries, we are more likely to send individuals to prison for crimes that in other countries you wouldn't get a prison sentence. For example, about 60% of individuals convicted of an assault in the United States will serve prison time. In Australia, only 8% of individuals convicted of an assault will get prison time. Also, our sentences are much longer, especially when you look at drug offenses. So here's another example. We actually impose life sentences in this country. When you look at Scandinavia, or even Australia or the UK, a life sentence is 15 years. In the United States, a life sentence means you will die in prison. The United States also has much more draconian prisons. Our prisons are harsh. Later, when you review the images of prisons, you will see the difference in how inmates live in the United States and how inmates live in other countries. So many studies have been done to assess the impact, the severity of our system. And here are the conclusions on severity. More severe punishments are no more effective than less severe punishments. Meaning, you impose a sentence for 15 years on someone, you impose a sentence of 5 years on someone for the same crime, the recidivism rate would be the same. More severe punishments may actually increase the likelihood of subsequent crime, which is the exact opposite of what we want. The more severe the punishment you get, the more likely you are to recidivate. So they also looked at celerity and certainty. Increasing celerity of punishment does not reduce recidivism. Where we seem to have the greatest impact is certainty. However, it is not in the way that we would think. Those individuals who are already law-abiding, so people whose behavior we're not seeking to change, people whose behavior we're not seeking to deter, law-abiding individuals overestimate the certainty and severity of punishment. Okay, so if you're a law-abiding individual, you are more likely to think you're going to get caught for doing something wrong, and you're more likely to think that the punishment you're going to get is quite severe. Arrested people have higher rates of subsequent offending. So that means that individuals who are arrested are more likely to do it again than those individuals who are never arrested. So there are 3 criticisms that we have for the classical theory. The first criticism is that we assume that all individuals are motivated to engage in crime through the pursuit of self-interests. The next criticism, it assumes that all individuals are rational and we engage in crime to minimize pain and maximize pleasure, which doesn't really account for impulsivity of offending. The final criticism is that it neglects how other factors, besides celerity, besides severity, and besides certainty of punishment, influence criminal offending. So that is the end of our classical theory lecture.